humanitarian programs and operations that have reached millions of refugees, migrants, and displaced persons all around the world. His career highlights include assignments with the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Bureau of the Budget, State Department. He directed the establishment of the Bureau for Refugee Programs of the U.S. State Department, where he served as First Deputy Assistant Secretary for Programs and Budgets, and was later Director of the Bureau for Refugee Programs under the Reagan administration. He also served 2 terms as Director General of the International Organization for Migration, or IOM, in Geneva, Switzerland. Is chairman of the board emeritus for the USA for IOM, and has served on numerous boards of NGOs and international organizations. Jim has testified before many congressional committees and has spoken before IOM governing bodies. His career spanned every U.S. administration since Kennedy, and he was involved in international responses to every significant humanitarian emergency during the decades between 1978 and 1998. He is the author of the book, We're in Danger, Who Will Help Us? Refugees and Migrants, A Test of Civilization, and his recent article, The Humanitarian Journey from Root Causes to Recovery, was just published in the Harvard Data Science Review. Jim is going to give us more details and history on his humanitarian work responding to the needs of refugees, migrants, and displaced persons around the world, lessons learned from these experiences, and his insight into the current refugee and migrant issues. Let's give Jim a warm welcome.
In the spirit of humanitarian cooperation, Susan and I will be tag teaming the questions tonight. Jim, could you discuss how you became involved in refugee and immigration or migration issues, and what President Jimmy Carter's role was in your life and career? And I think I have a good idea of where you're starting, the beginning of the international human rights effort, otherwise known as never underestimate a First Lady.
Thank you, Russ, and thank you for the invitation tonight. I'm sort of sad because 2 of my heroes, Jimmy Carter, just gone into special hospice care. My other hero was Ronald Reagan. I served as Assistant Secretary of State for both of these gentlemen, and they were fantastic. And I've been all over the world with both of them, I'm just saying, where do we get the new Carters and Reagans? But I just wanted to make a little comment before we start, that my career began with Carter and was continued with Reagan. But significantly, I started with the Democratic administration. And I created the refugee program under Jimmy Carter. I was in charge of that, actually. He did it. But at the end of Carter, everybody, as administration changes, you all start thinking about resigning and making room for the next group. Well, I didn't resign, and nobody ever came and asked me to resign. I was the first Assistant Secretary to testify before Congress under the new Republican administration at a very critical time in the refugee program. And when George Shultz finally ended up being my boss, he was a Secretary of State. I asked him one day, I had worked with George over in a place called OMB years before when he was the budget director. And he and I had been through a lot together. Now he was going to be my boss in the State Department. So I said, George, do I stay or do I make plans or whatever? He said, Jim, we just talked to Reagan, and he said, this program, the humanitarian program, is different than everything else we do in the state. that Reagan told me, George, you get the best person you can find. And I'm gonna appoint that person. And he appointed me. In fact, I had never left. I was staying there. So I found both of these gentlemen were big on something they call nonpartisan. And I'm great evidence of how that played out. The fact that our bureau could really perform almost gigantic strides and accomplishments. At the end of the day, I talked to George Schultz. I went out to see him in his office in Stanford University in California. And I said, George, and he told me, he said, the refugee program was the most significant thing I did as Secretary of State. And he said, the reason we were able to unite the world was because we had the same person we carried over. We had continuity. We were nonpartisan. And I just see so much. In fact, I was going to bring with me. I went through the paper last Friday and pulled out all of the areas where we're presently failing because we're overly partisan. I'm saying this for you tonight will be an example of something that was totally different. And I'm sorry for taking so long, Susan, but I thought that would kick it off.
Okay, another question. You and other experts regard the Indochina refugee experience as one of the notable examples of global cooperation for humanitarian challenges in the past 50 years. Can you please explain why? And can you also talk about a little more about the Carter-Reagan-Schultz collaboration that made that possible and what we learned from it?
Okay. One of the, Jimmy Carter decided to emphasize refugees. It was going to be one of his key priorities. And when we started, Southeast Asia was burning. We had just pulled out of our troops from Vietnam. We left, we were the protector. We figured about 40 million people in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were left high and dry. Their protector, who they had depended on, had pulled out, ran off during the night. So when I back in the State Department, Carter and then Reagan said, we have got to launch a rescue program, probably larger in size than anything since World War II. They decided, Carter did, to bring me over from a place called OMB. I was the international affairs person there with probably the best sense of knowledge of the State Department since I was the guy they had to go to get money and get legislation. So they asked me to come over, and I knew the State Department Bureau for Refugee Programs was a tragedy. It was mismanaged, 3 congressional investigations underway. And I said, you want me to come over there and wreck my career for this? They said, that's exactly right. So I did. First thing we had to do is get some legislation. So we wrote something called the Refugee Act. And it was supposed to be for 1979, but Carter wanted to delay a little bit because other things were happening in Asia. So I agreed, and we put it forward. The act did a lot of good things. It defined what a refugee is. A person who's fleeing for their life with a fear of persecution based on race, religion, national origin, not able to avail themselves of the protection of their home country, and they're out of the country. We worked with all the proper international authorities. We took the international definition, which the UN had prepared, and we incorporated that into American legislation. We provided the Refugee Act with a worldwide focus. First time we'd ever had any refugee organization to have such a focus. We provided a legal way to bring a person who's been persecuted into this country, and we called it legal refugee status. Previously, we had brought people into this country under something called parole, which we'll hear about today. Parole was created in the 1950s, first used in the Hungarian Revolution. It was meant to be temporary, small. So we created the refugee designation, and under my administration, we brought in upwards of 1.2 million refugees into this country. As it turns out, since the 1980 Refugee Act, only about 6.2 million refugees have ever come to this country under that status. Because as crises occurred, we went to other mechanisms. We tried different kinds of immigration fixes. We didn't want to acknowledge that we had something called refugees in the resettlement countries. So over time, refugee, although we have put in many safeguards and protections under that regime, it's very rarely used. I just noticed the other day that President Biden is making a number of changes. One of them, he says, is to reinstitute the refugee program. But there are other changes in the Refugee Act, but I won't go through them. But that was a major accomplishment of our time. It provided us a basis, a legislative basis from which to work. I think that was significant.
Ready for the next?
Yes.
Throughout your book, you call on governments to put victims at the center of their foreign policy deliberations, and you call the rescue of Soviet Jews the best example of this strategy in action. Can you expand on your reasoning?
When Reagan was elected, first term, he did nothing in the terms of relations with Russia or any of our major combatants. The second term, he told George Shultz he wanted to do something significant. He wanted to confront the Russians. He wanted to talk about the global issues that are separating us. So George started a series of discussions with his opposite number in the Soviet Union, Edward Shevardnadze. Said Reagan is ready to talk. Maybe Gorbachev could do the same thing. So it started a dialogue, and over time, Reagan and Gorbachev decided to meet in 4 different summits. And they were going to discuss trade, arms control, and human rights. So this is really important for the 2 major world powers to be talking about those issues. So they had these summits. First one was in Geneva. Second one was in Iceland. Third one was in Washington, and the fourth one was in Moscow. During those discussions, and by the way, during the Iceland meeting, Reagan and Shultz decided to show a sign of support. So they called Avital Zaransky, who's husband was the most famous dissident, and told her that her husband would be released on a bridge separating Potsdam and Berlin the next morning. It was something that we had been fighting for years, to get his release from the Soviet Union. He was probably one of the more famous dissidents. At any rate, Reagan and Gorbachev got to the second summit in Iceland. They agreed to dismantle all intermediate range nuclear missiles. They'd agreed on a whole range of different things. And one of the side effects of their discussion was a massive agreement on human rights, which would be releasing Soviet Jews. As they were breaking up that meeting, Gorbachev told Reagan, "I guess this means that you will now agree to Star Wars." And Reagan pulled out, "Star Wars? Absolutely not." Gorbachev said, "Then our meeting is over." They broke up, but even though it was a very sad point, they went back home, and Reagan and Shevardnadze continued working. And by the time the next summit occurred, they discussed and agreed on the largest arms control agreement ever up to that point. They announced the largest trade agreement between the U.S. and Russia ever. They announced that Soviet Jews, many refuseniks, who had been hiding for years, and a major objective of the U.S. was to free Soviet Jews. They were allowed to leave. So over the next few years, over 1 million trapped Soviet Jews were allowed to escape the Soviet Union and resettle primarily in Israel. About 60%, about a third came to the U.S. and the rest to other countries around the world. But I told Reagan at one point that, this is the greatest example I've ever seen of putting the refugee issue in the center of foreign policy discussions. That's where they've got to be if they're going to ever be resolved. But I think these fellows showed how they could work together, and they amounted to a massive accomplishment for the world. I'll stop there.
Okay, so during your time with the State Department and the IOM, the Middle East was a region of great crisis and challenges. Can you discuss, first of all, your role as a mediator between the Israel and the PLO regarding Palestinian returns to the region, and also comment on maybe the Persian Gulf War in Syria?
One afternoon in my Geneva office, I got a visit from the PLO ambassador in Geneva. He said, "Yasser Arafat would like to see you. Would you mind going over to his office?" And of course I said I would be delighted to talk with him. So I went, and Bill Clinton, if you might recall, had an Oslo summit in the mid-90s. One of the Jewish and the Arab side came together. But one of the agreements was that they would try to find some way that those Palestinians who were dislocated when Israel was created and forced to go other places to survive. So an objective of theirs had always been to allow those who wanted to return to the region. They had known me from earlier days, because in my State Department job, one of the main programs that I had was the UN Relief and Works Administration for Palestinian refugees. So I had helped refugees in Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, Gaza, and all of the normal places in the region. So they asked me, would I be willing to use IOM as a focus point to start a return program. And I said, well, I'll certainly be glad to consider it. I'll have to talk to the Jewish side. This is not something we would do one side or the other. So we started a shuttle diplomacy. I would go back and forth between the ambassador there. Yitzhak Rabin was the Jewish prime minister. So I would go to see Rabin, then I would go to see Arafat in Geneva. At one point, Arafat asked me to go to Tunis, where his main headquarters, PLO headquarters were. And I went, and I stayed in a hotel for 2 days waiting for him to give me the green light to come. Then we got to his place, and it was heavily guarded and protected. I went in and met with him for about an hour. And we didn't agree on anything, but we got to know each other. And we continued the shuttle bit, and I was invited with Arafat to go to New York for the 50th anniversary of the UN, 1995. We continued our discussions. We were making great headway. I had identified a number of problems that would have to be resolved. But like everything in diplomacy, it's negotiable. 2 weeks later, Rabin was assassinated. I remember that event. Discussions fell apart. No more discussions. And I've been told by authorities and people who follow these more closely than I, that was probably one of the last significant opportunities that we had that we missed it. But anyway, that's the PLO. I got to know Rabin very well. Wonderful, wonderful man. During my time there, I worked a lot on Syria. By that time I left IOM, but my book, if you have a chance to read it, We're in Danger, Who Will Help Us? I decided to focus on one country when I came back and to discuss what has been happening since I was away for 10 years. The country I picked was Syria, and there's a very serious analysis in the book. I have determined that we probably misplayed Syria significantly. In fact, when we found millions of Syrian asylum seekers camped out in Europe, I had a meeting in Turkey with leaders that I could gather, and I said, we're about to make a gigantic mistake. If you could go back and follow the example we used with Indo-Chinese, I think you'd find this problem a lot easier to deal with. But they were so far gone, they allowed 1 million asylum seekers into Germany. None of them were vetted, we didn't know who they were. But Germany, over time, has done a very good job to pick up the pieces and run with them. But this was not the ideal example of how one should address these issues. But I think I'm taking too much time, so maybe we'll stop here.
May I ask a question? Are you opening for questions yet, or should I?
Could you wait till the end?
Sure.
Is it already? Okay.
We'll give you time at the end.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you discuss the resolution of the Falasha issue, meaning the Ethiopian Jews, in Sudan and Ethiopia, 1984 Horn of Africa famine, and the conflicts in Rwanda and Uganda that occurred during your time in office?
The Falasha are a special group. They're Ethiopian Jews. They come from the Gondar region of Ethiopia. They're very persecuted. The communist Mengistu regime during my time tried to kill as many of them as he could. They say the Falasha spring from Solomon and Sheba. one of their children went to Ethiopia. I think his name was Abimelech. And he started the Ethiopian compound there. And over time, many others have come. But as most Jews, they were severely persecuted. When they got to, many of them were trying to leave the Gondar region. They traveled for days walking through deserts to get to the Sudan. They were put in refugee camps. We worked special operations with the Israeli government. We did Operation Moses, Operation Sheba, Operation Solomon. We brought all of those Falashim who wanted to leave. We helped them to get to Israel. One of those Falasha that we helped was a family. They had a little girl, 3 years old. We helped them in their camp. We helped them get to Israel. She grew up in Israel, got educated, did her work there. 2 years ago, she was made the first immigrant minister in the Israeli government. The first Falasha. And they're really taking off now. They're a very handsome group of people, very able to take advantage of education. But the Falasha were, I would say, in my time there, the most political and difficult population we dealt with. It was so difficult that when I got to IOM, I was trying to get some of the Arab governments into our organization. And then after one of our council meetings, they came up and said, Mr. Purcell, we got one question only that keeps us from joining. Did IOM or you personally participate in this movement of Falasha to Israel? And that will make the difference of whether Egypt joins and all the other African and Arab governments. I said, I'm going to tell you the truth. We did, and it was the right thing to do. And I gave them my justification for our action. And they said, well, we knew that was the answer. We just wanted to see if you would ever say it. I did. Right now, the African contingent in IOM membership is one of the largest and most powerful. Africans are all in IOM now. But we had to break that logjam, and the Falasha were critical to that. Okay?
Are you still involved in the resettlement of Afghan refugees? And what can you tell us about the origins of this issue?
I am still involved, but I will go back. 1979, I was the acting director of the refugee program in the State Department. I've been doing Southeast Asia stuff every day, 24 hours. We work 24/7 until you just pass out. Southeast Asia was so important that we do it right. But I came into my office one morning on the weekend, and I saw that the cable traffic for once was not from Asia. It was from Afghanistan. Soviets had invaded, we figure upwards of 5 to 7 million Afghans were on the run. They went to Pakistan. Some of them went into Arab countries, other in the region. But that started, for us, probably the largest, at that point, refugee program in the world was Afghanistan. So I followed that for 9 years. While the Mujahideen developed. They ran the Soviets ragged, and finally Gorbachev was forced to withdraw. But I have followed those. I know the Mujahideen, over time, morphed into the Taliban. kept an abiding interest in Afghanistan. When this incident, most recent incident occurred, when they had the plane that couldn't get people out, I got a lot of requests from people to try to help to use the IOM auspices to do that. And we were able to do a fair amount. We worked with the military and the various embassies, got 124,000 people out. And my deputy, and when I was in RP, a fellow named Gene Dewey, he and I wrote a letter to the Secretary General, to the head of IOM, to the head of UNHCR, President of the United States, and tell them that we did a lousy job, but we gotta help these people. I recommended that as we had nothing else, they use parole as the only technique available. You did, they got here, and I've been following their assimilation in this country. I've been hopeful that over time, the U.S. and other governments can do more to help those left behind. In fact, I got so many letters for help. I got one, a guy you might remember, Sam Watterson, plays in the head prosecutor on Law and Order. He identified 5 people for me. He knew where they were hiding. And I sent a group in there and we found them. And they brought them out. So I'm still doing that. I have a problem. I don't think parole's the right way to do this. We should have brought them in as refugees. As parolees, they have limited time to stay here. They have no benefits as we had planned to give refugees in this country. It was a make-do solution when I proposed it. But now we've tried things called the Adjustment Acts, which would give normal benefits and assurance of staying. We took it up to the Congress and they won't have anything to do with it now. I have a fellow who works with me who approached the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee and asked him about doing adjustment acts, not only for the Afghans, but for the Ukrainians. He said, absolutely not. So I'm not really optimistic. But I think this is the kind of problem we get when we don't use the mechanisms that were created to address these kind of problems. And we make up new things on the run. That's what we've done for so many populations now. But I would love to be able to do more on Afghans. And I've got a team of retirees from the military, intelligence, State Department, and we're bugging the authorities to death on Afghans and Ukrainians. We think we can do a lot better.
Can you talk to us about the evolution of American policy toward people fleeing Central America and the Caribbean?
So I found when I was the refugee director that Central America and the Caribbean was the toughest group for me to deal with. And I found what people all over the world, the neighbors closest to you, are the most difficult to address. I had refugee camps situated all over Central America. And we followed, as you know, the UN's protocol with regard to refugee solutions. We have 3 priorities. Repatriation, and that can be done safely. Regional settlement, that's within the region where all the ties are the greatest. You try those 2 first, and only if you can't use those, you go to something called third country resettlement. In Asia, we had to go to that third country because it was impossible, since we had lost a war there, to use the first 2, what they call durable solutions. In Central America, I had staff that were stationed there, and we used all of the expertise in the department. We determined that the first 2 durable solutions were viable in Central America. And we put tons of money building up safe asylum camps. But we didn't move all the way as many of the church groups and the NGOs. They wanted me to launch a resettlement program similar to what we had done to the Vietnamese. And I told them that would be totally contrary to our principles of following durable solutions. That provoked a great deal of attack. And the problem was, during much of that time, Reagan was president. And a lot of the liberal NGO and church community were, and for legitimate reasons, were opposed to Reagan's policy in Central America. They were fearful that he had catered to right-wing autocrats, military leaders, and that there were legitimate persecution occurring. So we were at loggerheads with a lot of people who were our major allies in other regions of the world. But Central America was different. So we have had, if we pull this into the future, I think our policy, our migration, and I'm getting it out of my field, our migration policy has been all wrong. Refugee policy has not been able to work. As I mentioned earlier, various administrations have made up new programs as they go along in order to avoid using refugees or normal immigration. So very few refugees per se, as we created in the Refugee Act, have come to this country. More could if we could agree on the ground rules. A lot of the mass movement that has been so problematic in this country has resulted in 4.5 million, what they call unauthorized, are here. We've got to deal with them. This president has come up with some very innovative ideas. But I'm going over my time, and maybe somebody can ask a question. I will say what the new ideas are and what I think about them.
So what are the new ideas and what do you think about them?
If you look back in my book, I have elucidated my favorite solution. And it's the Indo-Chinese approach. It worked. We took a region which we were at war with. We worked for years. In fact, it was almost 20 years we were there. And I told the governments there, if you guys help us solve this refugee problem, you're going to see that Cambodia and Vietnam and Laos, they're all going to prosper and they're going to take off. Well, we did. We had something called the Comprehensive Plan of Action for Southeast Asia. We did solve it. We even sent over 500,000 Vietnamese back who didn't qualify for any refugee or immigration program against the opposition of the governments, but we did it because it was the UN program. It was the UN solution. But eventually, it was accepted. And what has happened is what we predicted, that Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos would blossom. But what the new things that we've done I had suggested that we tried that approach in Central America and whatnot. Part of my approach was to not allow people to come close to borders. I found that the major problems ensued when people surrounded borders. Instead, all over Asia, I created a series of asylum camps. I told all the refugees there, you can go into those camps. They're protected. Nobody can get at you. We'll make sure that all of your needs for health and subsistence are covered, and we will work on durable solutions for you. And if we determine that the durable solution that's best for you is the third one, it's third country, we'll help you. We'll work with you to do it. And I had NGOs there to help me process those cases. But I said, if you come up to this border, are you trying to come into any country in the region illegally or unauthorized? I don't like to use the word illegally when talking about people. I'll say it's unauthorized. We will probably deport you back to where you came. Well, I've been telling various administrations here for years that you've got to take that concept that I proposed and torque it for these new populations. You don't follow all I did down the line, but you use it, and Mr. Biden has done that. I know there are a lot of you probably will disagree with what he's done, but I think he's on the right track. He's now telling people, if you, and this is only recently, by the way, last couple of weeks, if you try to come illegally across that border, you won't make it. Instead, and this is the new era, we've come up with an app, CPB1. If you use that app and put in your information about yourself, send it off to the addresses that are included there. We'll schedule you an interview at a lawful processing site. The first, he experimented on that with Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans a few weeks back. And the next week, the population of unauthorized crowding the border went down by 97%. Something that I've been saying all along. If you provide people with a legal alternative, they will use it. They're coming up here, clumping around this border because that's all that's available for them. So I think, and I know President Biden is taking flack from all sides now, from the hardliners who don't like immigration at all. On the other side, you've got some of the more liberal groups in our country today that are chastising him because they're saying he's not providing opportunities anymore. So I think he's moving in a good direction. My main problem with it is they're using parole. See, I think what we ought to get back to the point of saying we have created a legitimate vehicle for bringing people into this country. If you're persecuted and you hit all the enumerated criteria, we'll process you as a refugee. We know you're not going to go back home, so we're going to make it possible for you to stay. You're going to get aided by the government. We used to call it cash and medical assistance. I'm sure they've got different terms now. But there are solutions, I think, that are possible. What I've just suggested is a beginning step, a baby step. But Biden has had to do this because in his first 2 years, even though he promised all of these legislative reforms of immigration that he was going to undertake, not a single one of them has even been considered. So he's getting no help from the Congress. He's got to do things his way, and he's gone with executive orders. I'm not crazy about, but he had no choice. But if we can get to the point that we have a system that works, the executive can make proposals, the Congress will consider them. It's very clear most of the steps the United States needs to take, but they require legislation. So again, I've gone too long, but.
Thank you. Jim, there have been some papers passed around here on the tables about the Welcome Corps. Could you comment on the Welcome Corps? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I've been working on this for some time with the resettlement people in the State Department. But I told them from my experience, and I think from discussions I've had with others, the same welcoming attitude is still out there. But we've got to unleash it somehow. So I didn't call it Welcome Corps, but I said, I have visited so many refugee homes, and I've watched mothers and fathers and children. I know, and NGOs all over this country, if we can stimulate it, there's going to be a groundswell of support for refugees or parolees or whatever we decide to call them. So, in discussions with the resettlement people in the state, they came up with the name Welcome Corps, and I said, I think that's really, it sounds great. So they've decided, and they've tested it out. They're looking for 10,000 volunteers, American volunteers, over the next few months. And they're going to be trained by the present slate of NGOs that already work on refugees. And they're going to identify the refugees. We have already in the state a long list of people who've been interviewed and processed and put into the line. And these folks can select one of them. They'll be made available. They'll be brought to this country. They'll have to meet them, help them go through the normal stuff that a refugee goes through. It's assimilating into this country. But they will try to help 5,000 refugees. And it's important that I'm saying these are refugees. The Welcome Center is going to produce refugees at the end of the line. They're going to try to get the American public concentrating again on this legal concept of refugee. But I think it's a great idea. The enthusiasm that we've seen thus far is very, very encouraging. And I would think that and they're coming from all over the country right now. I'm not doing it personally, but I'm being fed information from the State Department. There is, they think, wide receptivity to the notion of the Welcome Corps. And people are wondering, why didn't we ever do that before?
Just a quick request, how are you doing for time? Is it 8 o'clock yet?
10 to 8.
I guess we have time for a couple more of these questions, and then I want to make sure people in the audience have the opportunity. So President Reagan nominated you to a 5-year term as Director General of the IOM in 1988. And then President Clinton asked you to stand for a second term in 1993. Can you briefly describe the role and contributions of IOM over the next decades of humanitarian work around the world?
It's a special organization. IOM was created at a migration conference in Brussels in 1956. And its name, they gave it a name, the Provisional Intergovernmental Committee for the Movement of Migrants in Europe. The acronym would be PICME. It was very appropriate for a migration organization. But they did a lot of work on resettling Jews and other displaced from World War II and became very well known for that. In fact, if you go to any place where migrants are coming in, you'll see many of them carry something, a little plastic bag. That's called the IOM bag. And almost every migrant refugee who's ever come into this country brings their documents and other things in an IOM bag. When I got there, I found that IOM, like most organizations, had become slow, cranky. It was totally Euro-centered and American-centered. It had centralized all of its management authorities and funding to such a degree that input from the field was almost unheard of. So I got there and I said, guys, this little organization is on its last legs. Unless we do something significant, it won't be here this time 2 years from now. Well, we've been into I called it re-engineering. the short term was management review. And I said, we're gonna take this centralized agency, we're gonna blow it apart in Geneva, and we're gonna pick the pieces that come out, and we're gonna create sub-regional offices all over the world. I want you folks out there talking to real refugees and migrants. Most migrants don't show up in Geneva, Switzerland. If you're gonna ever shake hands with one, you're gonna have to get out into the field. So it was very cataclysmic for our organization. We had people who had become used to living the good life in Geneva. Nobody wanted to go to the field. I said, for goodness sakes, we're an international migration organization and everybody wants to stay in Geneva. Well, I didn't do that. We put them out. When I started that, IOM was maybe $200 million. What we found happened, and I knew it would, is IOM is full of entrepreneurs. They had the chance to get out there and talk to foreign ministers, interior ministers, and actual country folks. They found all kinds of projects and needs that had been going unaddressed. We told them, you put those in the form of projects, we'll send them to the EU, we'll send them to the Americans, and to all of the Japanese, and we'll get you money. Well, what's happened is that thing has thrived. IOM budget now probably puts them maybe the second or third largest international organization. They have really prospered. And I think the thing that was the key to that was getting out of this mentality that everything has to be conceived, programmed, planned at a central level. And we put that authority out in the field, and rather than a few people working on that kind of stuff, we now have thousands all over the world. And migration has become unto its own. UN, to prove of that, a couple of years ago, something that I've been working on for ages, back when I was there. I want to get IOM into the UN. UN is the big stage. All the major work has got to be played out on that stage. We got IOM into the UN 2 years ago. It's now called the UN International Organization for Migration. And it is prospering like, it's hard to say that a humanitarian organization is prospering, but they are. They're responding to needs now. And I am so happy and proud of those folks. In fact, when I went back once, I was away for 10 years. The next Director General didn't want to give me much credit, so he never invited me to come back. But when I finally did, by that time, my changes had time to be rooted. And they were working. And I was invited by the next DG to come back for a Global Chiefs of Mission meeting in Geneva. And I looked around the room, and we took one of the big conference rooms in the Palais, and it was packed. I said, these can't possibly be IOM. There are too many of them. But they had dinner, and they asked me to sit at the head table. And they knew the big question, and I didn't know how what I had proposed had turned out. And they had been precluded from talking to me during the next 10 years. But when I got there and they introduced me, and I waved my hand, and the DG then, a friend of mine, said, no, stand up. And I did, and the place exploded. I said, nonverbal communication from the very people you're trying to reach is really important. But I am really happy with IOM. I think it's done well. It's got to be a good UN partner, and I think it's in a good way now.
Thank you. And one last question. How have your Christian beliefs guided your humanitarian work?
I'm the son of missionaries, Baptist missionaries in the South. My dad was not a preacher though. He was assigned Appalachia. He had 7 counties in Tennessee and Appalachia. He was back in all of those mountains. He bought himself a little Willys Jeep so he could get back there. Whenever you had a problem, and if you live in that area, the guy you talked to was James Purcell. Because he would figure out a way to get you into town or get you to a doctor or get some food out to you. So he did that. Then he went down to Florida and he worked among migrants, Indians. So I grew up in this business. And they're strong, strong Christians, let me tell you. And I was trained. What does Jesus expect of you? When you see hunger, when you see thirst, when you see need, what do? That's your challenge. I grew up in that every day. And I thank God that I did. I think if ever anybody was prepared, the kind of work that I ultimately did, I was. I give God great credit for the wonderful things He has done in my life through me. And I offered in the early stages to be used. And I said, I will be open and I'll be very aggressive. I've got a job to do. I won't let anything stop me from getting it done. And that's been pretty much the way I'm regarded. But I got all in. I think that motivated me. I got to know all of the church-based NGOs in the refugee business. They were all contractors for us to resettle refugees. Wonderful, wonderful people in those organizations. And their spirit manifests itself throughout this. At one point, I had 12 national NGOs. We had a refugee in every congregation, parish, whatever, in this country. I would go to visit. I went out a lot to talk to people who were being resettled. And I noticed they were doing it the right way. Education, family, hard work. Kids were breaking records all over the place. You know, when I was in Indochina, I created an English language training program for all refugees coming to this country. Eventually, I made this applicable to refugees from all regions. We had in Manila and in Indonesia, large camps in Manila. I could, at any one point, have, 19,000 people studying English. That went on for years. You have English language, cultural orientation, vocational skills training, and we're doing English language for young children. We had 7 levels of ESL. We would measure where they were. And then when they got resettled, we figure out what's your level. And when we got a sponsor back here, we would talk to the NGOs sponsoring them in their resettlement, and we'd make sure they started at that level. We had a good handoff. But I don't know, it was very expensive. I used, in Manila, I used Philippine English speakers. They were great. I could do it at a fraction of the cost. But I figured that in any degree that we can help migrants and refugees before they get here, then we should do it. And I'm making proposals now for the current crop. We need to be doing a great deal more for them. But anyway, I hope that answers the question.
We open it up to the audience now? Okay, you had a question. Would you like to start?
I'm just curious, I encountered a number, oh, sorry. Thank you. First of all, thank you for that. Such an interesting history of what you've done. And I've encountered a number of people here in the United States now who say that they're here on asylum waiting their legal case to be brought to court and so on. But I mean, it's been years and years and years. So did they come as a parolee? Or are there certain countries that each year are given a number of, allow a number of people to come in on a